A chemical plant 3 miles outside town exploded at 6:52 on a Tuesday evening, and within 40 minutes a small community hospital was flooded with patients, seizing, foaming at the mouth, and dying of something none of its doctors could identify. The quiet nurse who kept to herself for 2 years took one look at the symptoms and knew exactly what was killing them, because she'd spent 4 years learning how not to let it. Millbrook Community Hospital served a town of 9,000 people, tucked into a valley best known for 2 things: a covered bridge on the historical registry and the Corrigan Chemical Works plant on its northern edge, which had manufactured industrial pesticides and agricultural compounds for going on 60 years. The hospital was small, 60 beds, a single attending on nights, an ER built for farm accidents, heart attacks, and the occasional bad car wreck on the county highway. Nobody in Millbrook had ever had reason to think very hard about what, exactly, the plant made, or what might happen if something inside it went catastrophically wrong. Imogen Larkspur had worked Millbrook's ER for 2 years, and in that time had become one of those quiet fixtures a small hospital absorbs without ever really examining. She was 32, pale and freckled, with reddish hair kept in a low knot, and a habit of arriving early and leaving without saying much. She was competent in an unremarkable way, good with IVs, careful with charting, pleasant enough with patients, but she rarely offered an opinion unless asked directly, and in a hospital that ran on the confident, familiar rhythms of people who'd known each other for decades, that made her something close to invisible. Dr. Aldric Penrose, Millbrook's senior attending, had worked the ER for 18 years and had a reputation, not entirely undeserved, for being the smartest doctor most of his patients would ever meet. He liked Imogen well enough. He also didn't think about her much. "Larkspur, I need you on vitals in Bay 2. Nothing complicated," he'd say, "the kind of assignment you gave someone you trusted to follow directions, and not much else." "Of course, doctor," Imogen would say, and go. Charge nurse Beatrix Coldwell, who'd run Millbrook's floor for over 20 years, had noticed something the others hadn't quite put into words. "She reads every incident report that comes through this place," she mentioned once to another nurse, watching Imogen quietly scan a hazmat bulletin that had come in with the morning paperwork, something nobody else on staff ever bothered to look at twice. "Every single one. I don't know why, she just pays attention to things the rest of us skip past." "Maybe she's just thorough," the other nurse shrugged. "Doesn't hurt anybody." Nobody at Millbrook knew that Imogen Larkspur had once been Specialist Imogen Larkspur, a combat medic who had spent 4 years attached to an Army chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear defense company, a CBRN unit whose entire purpose was preparing for, detecting, and treating exposure to exactly the kind of invisible, silent threats that didn't announce themselves with blood or shrapnel, only with symptoms that could look like almost anything until you knew precisely what you were looking at. She had spent countless hours in full protective gear, running decontamination lines, memorizing antidote protocols for a dozen different classes of chemical agents, and treating soldiers and civilians alike after exposure incidents that never made the news back home. She had a service commendation for running an emergency decontamination and treatment site after an industrial accident overseas released a toxic plume over a refugee camp, working 20 hours straight in a gas mask to save as many people as the antidotes on hand allowed her to save, and a private, permanent grief for the ones the antidotes hadn't been enough for. She had left the Army 3 years ago and settled in Millbrook because it was about as far from an industrial hazard as she could imagine, a sleepy valley town, a hospital that saw broken bones and chest pain, nothing that would ever again ask her to remember exactly what a nerve agent exposure looked like in its earliest, most treatable minutes. She hadn't thought, in 2 years, about the plant on the edge of town at all. It had simply been part of the landscape, the way a water tower or a grain silo is part of a landscape, present, unremarkable, never actually considered. That changed at 6:52 on a Tuesday evening in October. A corroded valve on a storage tank at Corrigan Chemical Works failed during a routine transfer process, triggering a runaway reaction between 2 compounds that were never supposed to mix in the quantities that evening, they did. The resulting explosion tore through the plant's western processing unit and sent a dense, yellow-brown chemical cloud rolling low across the valley on a light evening wind, directly over a residential neighborhood, an elementary school parking lot where an evening soccer practice was just wrapping up, and the county highway. The 911 calls started within minutes, but the truly frightening thing, the thing that would define the next several hours, was that nobody calling in and nobody responding had any real idea what they were dealing with. The plant's own emergency notification system, which was supposed to broadcast the specific compound involved to first responders, had been destroyed in the initial blast. "We've got multiple patients incoming from a chemical plant explosion out on Route 9. The radio at Millbrook's nurses' station crackled with the dispatcher's voice, tight with barely controlled alarm. "Symptoms are, I don't have a clear picture, but it's not good. Respiratory distress, some seizure activity reported. EMS is bringing everyone here. We're the closest facility." Dr. Penrose looked up sharply. "What compound? What are we treating?" "Unknown, doctor. Corrigan's emergency line isn't answering. First responders on scene are working blind." The first ambulance arrived 9 minutes later, and what came through Millbrook's doors after that was unlike anything the hospital's small ER had ever processed. A father and daughter, both drenched in sweat, pupils constricted to pinpoints, their breathing a wet, labored rattle, muscles twitching in small, involuntary spasms. A teenage boy from the soccer practice, unconscious, foaming faintly at the mouth, his skin an alarming shade of gray-blue. A plant worker, still in half his protective gear, seizing on the gurney despite 2 rounds of standard anti-seizure medication that did nothing to stop it. "I don't understand," Penrose said, moving frantically between patients, his usual confidence cracking under the weight of symptoms that matched nothing in his considerable experience. "This isn't smoke inhalation. It's not a standard toxic exposure pattern. The seizures aren't responding to lorazepam." Imogen had been checking vitals in Bay 2 when the first patients arrived. She stepped into the hallway, took one look at the plant worker's pinpoint pupils, the excessive salivation, the muscle fasciculations twitching visibly under his skin, and something in her chest went very cold and very still. She knew this presentation. She had studied it, drilled it, treated it in conditions far worse than this. It had a name, and a very specific, very narrow treatment window, and if she was right, Millbrook's standard emergency protocols were about to actively make things worse instead of better. Dr. Penrose, Imogen's voice, when it came, had none of its usual quiet deference in it at all. "Stop the lorazepam, that's not going to touch these seizures, and we're running out of time to do the thing that will." Penrose turned, startled by the tone as much as the words. "Excuse me?" Pinpoint pupils, excessive salivation, muscle fasciculations, seizures that don't respond to benzodiazepines. That's the classic presentation of organophosphate poisoning. Imogen was already moving toward the supply room, already running through a mental inventory of what Millbrook's small pharmacy would and wouldn't have on hand. Corrigan makes pesticides. Organophosphate compounds are a core ingredient in a lot of agricultural pesticide manufacturing. If that tank failure released an aerosolized precursor compound, everyone in that cloud has been exposed to something chemically similar to a nerve agent, and it is actively shutting down their nervous systems right now. The room went very quiet. "You think this is a nerve agent?" Penrose's face had gone pale. Not military grade, and probably not intentional, but the mechanism of toxicity in a lot of organophosphate pesticides is close enough to be treated the same way, and treated fast, or we lose everyone who came in that door in the last 10 minutes. Imogen was already pulling the hospital's small stock of atropine from the crash cart supply, nowhere near enough for the number of patients that were about to arrive, and she knew it instantly, with the flat, unforgiving mathematics of someone who had run exactly this calculation before, in worse conditions, with worse odds. "Doctor, I need you to trust me on the next 10 minutes, because there is no time to explain the biochemistry. Atropine in high doses, repeated as needed. It will not fully reverse what's happening, but it buys time these patients don't otherwise have." And I need you to call every pharmacy and veterinary clinic within 20 miles, because we do not have enough atropine in this building for the number of patients we're about to see. And organophosphate poisoning is common enough in livestock that most rural vet clinics keep a supply. Penrose stared at her for one more second of a lifetime of quietly underestimating the nurse he'd assigned to routine vitals, and then, for the second time that night, made the smartest decision available to him. Do it. What followed was among the most harrowing 3 hours in Millbrook Community Hospital's history. Patients kept arriving, 11, then 20, then more than 30, ranging from the soccer team's coach to an elderly couple who'd been walking their dog near the plant's perimeter fence, all of them presenting with some degree of the same terrifying constellation of symptoms. Imogen ran the response with a calm, absolute authority that transformed the small hospital's ER into something resembling a field triage station. She dosed atropine with a precision that came from years of memorized protocol, watching for the specific clinical markers, drying secretions, pupils beginning to dilate again, that told her a dose had worked versus the ones that needed to be repeated immediately. She flagged the sickest patients for the atropine infusions the moment the emergency shipment arrived from a veterinary clinic 40 minutes away, driven in personally by a terrified vet who hadn't fully understood why the hospital needed his entire stock, until Imogen explained it to him in 30 clipped seconds over the phone. She also, over Penrose's initial objection, insisted on a decontamination protocol for every incoming patient, clothing removed and bagged, skin rinsed, before anyone came fully into the treatment area, because organophosphates absorbed readily through skin, and every contaminated piece of clothing that came through Millbrook's doors was a secondary exposure risk to the staff treating it. "We don't have a decon setup," Penrose had said, frustrated, in the first chaotic minutes. "We're not equipped for this." "Then we improvise one, right now, in the ambulance bay, with a garden hose and plastic sheeting, if that's what we've got, because every nurse in this building who gets organophosphate residue on her hands from a patient's shirt becomes the next casualty, and then we lose staff faster than we can replace them." Imogen was already directing 2 orderlies to rig exactly that. "I've done this in worse conditions than a hospital parking lot. It works. Trust me." He did. For the rest of the night, he simply did, following her lead with the humbled, entirely functional deference of a man who had finally understood, in the middle of the worst crisis of his career, that the quiet nurse he'd underestimated for 2 years was the only reason his hospital was going to make it through the night with a survivable death toll. It was past 10 o'clock, the wave of incoming patients finally slowing as the last of the exposed population was accounted for, when a convoy of military vehicles rolled into Millbrook's parking lot. A National Guard CBRN response unit, mobilized the moment state authorities understood the scale of the industrial release, arriving to assist with ongoing decontamination and confirm the chemical identification for treating physicians across the region. The team's commanding officer, a broad-shouldered woman with the unmistakable bearing of someone who had spent a career walking toward exactly this kind of invisible danger, strode into the ER already scanning the room with quick, assessing eyes. "We're coordinating regional response to the Corrigan release," she said, voice carrying easily. "We've confirmed the compound, an organophosphate pesticide intermediate, exactly the toxicity profile you'd expect from a manufacturing accident of this type. We understand your facility began appropriate treatment protocols before confirmation came through from the state lab." That's actually remarkable, for a facility this size, without prior CBRN briefing." Her eyes swept the room and landed on a red-haired woman in decon gear, calmly checking a patient's pupil response with the fluid, practiced motion of someone who had done this exact assessment hundreds of times before. She stopped. "Larkspur?" Imogen looked up slowly. For the first time in 3 careful years, her face didn't try to hide anything at all. "Major Halsey," she said quietly. "It's been a while." "It has." Major Griffin Halsey crossed the room, disbelief and something like relief breaking across her weathered face. "I heard there was a facility out here running a textbook organophosphate response, before we even confirmed the compound, and I thought, that's not possible, not without someone who's actually done this before. I didn't expect that someone to be you. Penrose, standing nearby with a fresh vial of atropine in his hand, found his voice. You two know each other? Halsey let out a short, disbelieving laugh, looking around the ER, the improvised decon line, the precisely dosed atropine, the room functioning, however roughly, under conditions that should have overwhelmed it completely. Know her? Doctor, this woman ran a decontamination and treatment site after an industrial toxic release overseas that could have killed hundreds more people than it did, entirely because she recognized the exposure pattern in the first few minutes and didn't wait for confirmation to start treating. She's been doing exactly that, apparently, quietly, in your ER for 2 years, and none of you had any idea what you had standing in this building until tonight. Penrose looked at Imogen for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, the particular reckoning of a man forced to see, all at once, how completely he had misjudged someone. 2 years, he said hoarsely. I put you on routine vitals tonight. You never asked why I read every hazmat bulletin that came through this hospital, Imogen said, not unkindly, turning back to her patient. You just decided quiet meant nothing worth asking about. There wasn't time to let the moment breathe. The hospital still had dozens of patients needing ongoing monitoring, and Halsey's team went to work confirming decontamination protocols and coordinating the remaining atropine supply chain across 3 counties. While Imogen, working openly now instead of quietly at the margins, briefed the incoming military medical team with the same fluent, clinical precision she'd once used in briefings that had, once before, saved a refugee camp full of people most of the world would never hear about. By the time gray dawn light filtered into Millbrook Community Hospital's windows, the worst of the crisis had passed. Every patient who had made it through the doors alive was stable or improving. The decontamination site in the ambulance bay had processed over 60 exposed residents through the night. The state lab's official confirmation of the compound arrived 7 hours after Imogen had already identified it from symptoms alone. Imogen sat on a supply crate near the ambulance bay, a paper cup of hospital coffee gone cold in her hands, watching the last of the National Guard vehicles idle in the gray morning light. Beatrix sat down heavily beside her. For a while, neither of them said anything. You saved this town tonight, Beatrix said finally. Not just the patients you personally treated. If you hadn't caught what this was in those first few minutes, we would have lost people we can't get back. I've worked here 22 years and I have never seen anything close to what you did. Imogen shrugged, exhaustion sitting heavier on her than the weight of the night itself. I just did what needed doing. That's the thing, Beatrix said. You've been doing that quietly for 2 years. We just never had reason to see the size of what you actually knew. Dr. Penrose found her 20 minutes later, his usual confident bearing entirely absent. I owe you an apology I'm not sure I know how to make properly. I've spent 2 years assigning you to routine vitals and basic charting, and tonight, you may have single-handedly kept this entire town from a body count I don't want to think about. I was wrong about you in every way that matters. Imogen studied him for a moment, tired, but without any real edge to it. I let you believe what was easy to believe, Doctor. I wanted a life here that never asked me to remember what I used to know. Turns out you don't get to leave that kind of knowledge behind completely, you just get to decide when it matters again. She managed something close to a small, tired smile. I'm glad it mattered tonight, for the right reasons. Major Halsey found her as her team wrapped up their assessment, radios still crackling with updates from the ongoing regional response. There's going to be a full after-action review of tonight, and your name is going to be part of it, whether you're ready for that or not. I figured it would be. For what it's worth, Halsey offered her a tired, genuine smile. The Guard CBRN program is always looking for people who can read an exposure pattern faster than a state lab can confirm one. No pressure. Just, the door's open, if you ever want it. Imogen looked out over the valley, the chemical plant's ruined western unit still visible in the distance, smoke drifting thin and gray against a brightening sky. a whole town waking up to understand how close it had come to catastrophe. She thought about 3 years of careful invisibility, and about the 10 minutes that had just undone it completely, and found that what she felt wasn't dread. It was something quieter, the relief of no longer having to carry the weight of what she knew entirely alone. "I'll think about it," she said. And, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she meant it as something more than a polite deflection. The sun rose fully over Millbrook that morning, on a shaken but recovering town, a hospital that had held against a threat none of its staff had ever been trained to face, and a quiet nurse nobody would ever again mistake for someone with nothing worth asking about. Sometimes the person paying close, careful attention to things everyone else skips past is doing exactly that, because they already know, from hard experience, precisely how much can go wrong in the space of a few unwatched minutes, and precisely what it takes to be ready when it finally does. If this story of hidden knowledge, quiet vigilance, and one impossible night at Millbrook kept you watching until the end, hit that like button. Share it with someone who believes the quietest person in the room might be the one who already knows exactly what to do when everyone else is out of answers. And subscribe to Beyond the Silence Tales for more real-life inspired stories of the people who show up, quietly, exactly when it matters most.
Hi, I'm Gwyneth Wynne, the owner and manager of Beyond the Silence Tales. A chemical plant exploded 3 miles outside town, and within 40 minutes patients were seizing and foaming at the mouth with symptoms no doctor in the building could identify. The quiet nurse everyone overlooked took one look and knew exactly what was killing them, because she'd spent 4 years learning how not to let it. I'd really love to know what you think of this one. How did it make you feel? What stuck with me was that Imogen wasn't hiding because she didn't care anymore. She just needed a life that never asked her to remember what she used to know. It took a chemical cloud rolling over her own town to bring that knowledge back exactly when it mattered most. Which moment hit you hardest? Have you ever worked alongside someone quietly paying closer attention than anyone realized? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and if this story kept you on the edge of your seat, feel free to like or subscribe for more from Beyond the Silence Tales.